October 1918. Near the Somme, France. The sky was an iron sheet streaked with smoke, and the smell of burning oil hung like a promise over a landscape torn into ruts of mud and barbed wire. Below, the trenches coughed men and rats and the constant wet of wash from shells. Above, a small silver shape cut the clouds, a paper bird against a vast, indifferent blue. In the cockpit, hands steady on a warm control, an African-American man squinted through blown glass at a horizon he had learned to read like scripture. The leather of his helmet smelled of engine grease and tobacco. His name was Marcus Elijah Carter, and painted on the fuselage in bold black letters was a short sentence that would reappear throughout his life. "Above us all, we are equal." It was not only a motto, it was accusation and claim and consolation. In this film, we will trace how Marcus rose from a childhood slammed shut by prejudice to become a pilot condecorated by nations and at once silenced by the very institutions he saved. We will ask how one man carried a nation on his shoulders, and how memory both honors and forgets. Marcus was born in July 1896 in Meridian, Mississippi, in a narrow wooden house that leaned toward the railroad as if to listen. His mother, Lillian, washed other people's clothes until her fingers were raw, and his father, Samuel Carter, worked as a brakeman on freight trains, a man who kept his eyes on the horizon because facing men sometimes cost more than pride. The house smelt of starch and molasses, and the seasons were measured in work and the small mercies of neighbors. There was a single lamp and a battered Bible that Marcus would later use as a makeshift map to sketch the skies. The first time he heard the word that would shadow his life, he was 7, and it arrived on the lips of a teacher whose voice was thin and certain. That small verdict built a wall around the boy that no playground laughter could topple. Yet at night, with the train whistle a distant whale call, his father would hum a hymn and tell stories of far places a man could reach if he could only catch the right train. It was in these stories that Marcus first tasted exile and possibility. At 12, Marcus ran. Not in a single heroic flight, but in a sequence of small departures. He left a violent stepfather and boarded freight cars heading north with a sack of bread and a handcrafted compass his grandfather had given him. In Chicago, he slept in shadowed alleys, learned to fix a bicycle tire for a dime, and traded labor for a corner in a boarding house. He worked in a metal shop, where the heat taught him how metal could yield and then hold, and where a machinist named Rafael Ortega taught him to read engine blueprints as if they were sheet music. Rafael tightened bolts and told Marcus that engines were honest creatures. There was a sting to city nights, a taste of coal in the mouth, a cold that found the knuckles. Marcus learned to listen and to wait until opportunity arrived like a train whistle in the night. Those early years of errance were apprenticeship and formation. He became an acrobat for a traveling show for a season, a courier who delivered letters between storefronts, and a mechanic's helper in airfields that smelled of oil and varnish. In the evenings he would sit with Clara Monroe, a young painter who had come north from Virginia, and Samuel Tate, his younger brother, who had followed him during a winter, and listened to gossip and the slow inventions of life. These were the years Marcus found a hinge between his hands and the sky. He watched biplanes land with the precision of a prayer. The thump of their engines was a drumbeat that matched pulse. The shimmer of canvas wings taught him geometry, and the way pilots spoke about altitude with soft technical terms felt like a secret language he wanted to learn. When war widened across Europe, Marcus volunteered for ambulance duty in 1917 and arrived at the front in December 1917. The trenches were a world that ate shoes and voices. Mud clung like memory, and the sounds were a relentless taxonomy of ingestion. rain on tin, distant detonations, the sharp ceremonial cough of gas alarms. Marcus shoveled, bandaged, and watched young men become quieter, as if speech consumed too much oxygen. In a night fog, the fear smelled of damp wool and old coffee, and pain tasted metallic from uniforms that had been poisoned by shrapnel. He learned the anatomy of loss at a stretcher side, where Marie Dubois, a field nurse with eyes like flint, and Captain Harold Jensen, a lanky officer who read maps with a cigarette between his teeth, taught him that courage often looked like a small practical decision. One evening in a dugout, he heard a sound that changed him forever, the high screaming chord of aircraft above the mud, a sound that seemed to promise another element to life, one without barbed wire cutting the horizon. He found himself saying to Jensen, "I want to fly." The officer laughed at first until he saw Marcus's face, and then his laugh turned thin. Yet the seed was planted. Into that chaos, Marcus had a conversation that condensed urgency and hope, and which would echo later on. It was brief but carried weight, and it unfolds like this. Marcus said, "I do not belong in the mud, if I can be above it." Jensen answered, "You think the sky is blind to color?" Marcus said, "It sees a man and his hands." Marie Dubois leaned forward and said, "You have hands that know engines." A private named Daniel Hughes spat in the corner and said, "You will be shot down before they let you near the controls." Marcus looked at Daniel and said, "Maybe I will not be." Jensen shook his head and said, "The Army is a machine, and machines do not welcome unexpected gears." Marcus replied, "Then I will become a gear they cannot remove." There are 6 more lines between them where they argue about permission and prejudice, and the conversation ends with Marcus promising to learn to read every instrument until the idea of him in the cockpit was not an insult, but inevitability. That exchange carried the flavor of the trenches, a sour and metal taste of necessity, and a tactile sense of mud on knees and stitches on palms. It was a beginning and a refusal. The image of aircraft remained alight in Marcus's mind. In March 1918, after a bombardment, he watched a squadron land, and a pilot named Pierre Lacroix stepped down with hands that smelled of gasoline and a grin like a coin. Marcus found himself at the base gate. He spoke to the adjutant, who said repeatedly, "No colored man is trained to be a pilot here." Marcus kept coming back with small acts of utility, sweeping hangars, carrying parts, polishing fuselage panels, until mechanics like Rafael Ortega and a volunteer named Rosa Alvarez, who knew the right French words, whispered on his behalf. He learned to patch canvas and to listen to engine coughs and idles, and to feel when a propeller balanced properly. Training came in fragments, first in hidden practice on ground rigs, then with a daring lieutenant who allowed Marcus to taxi a trainer once while Pierre called encouragement over a cigarette. The first time Marcus took the stick, the cockpit smelled of fresh varnish and old fear, and his hands remembered the compass and the train and the way his father hummed. He was clumsy and elated, and it took persistence and the intervention of unusual allies to gain official notice. The missions that followed became the center of his legend. In June 1918, a reconnaissance sortie over a hostile sector turned into a rescue that would be recounted in mess halls and later silenced in brief official bulletins. Marcus and Pierre Lacroix were tasked with locating a lost battalion cut off behind enemy lines. The sky was a high whitewash, and the engine purred like a contented animal. From the cockpit, Marcus could smell the sharpness of cold oil and the sweetness of the canvas treated with resin. Visibility fell into a plain of snow and sound, and then a burst of ground fire that shook his teeth. In the radio voice that morning, he heard Pierre say, "Keep your eyes low, Carter," and Rafael Ortega over the ground said, "We have an open patch to your left." Marcus replied, "Turning left now." A crack of rounds. Pierre shouted, "Hold steady." The engine moaned. Marcus answered, "Pull up now." Pierre cried, "We have men below!" Raphael said, "Hold that!" Heading and Marcus tore the aircraft down into a valley of smoke and found the battalion like a group of soldiers scattered around a ruined farmhouse. He landed on rough ground with wheels sinking into a secret of mud and metal, and drove men into his cockpit 2 at a time and took off with a fuselage groaning and a propeller spitting grit. They returned with 3 wounded and 12 stunned survivors. Later that day in a dim tent, Captain Jensen found Marcus and said, "You saved lives today." Marcus replied, "It was the sky that showed me which way." Pierre patted his shoulder and said, "You flew true." The squadron awarded him an impromptu decoration of pinned ribbons and a small brass medal that Marcus later kept inside a worn leather flight bag. That medal would be one of the objects he guarded for the rest of his life. If you felt your breath catch when you heard that rescue, you are not alone. Moments like that reveal what the heart of this story asks of us, and how emotion behaves when it first finds a shape. If the scene surprised you, tell us a single line of this story that stayed with you in the comments. Type only the words or the phrase that landed on you, and your reply will help others find this person extraordinary. Your comments matter because they shape who we choose to remember. They might lead us to make a longer piece focused on a single episode, or to dig into the archives that hide official files. Now let us continue and see what came after the medals and the brief celebrations. Fame was a double-edged instrument. In public, Marcus was condecorated by a regional commander for bravery, and his picture briefly appeared in a French newspaper. He was introduced to a visiting delegation that included Admiral Wallace Grant, a rigid official whose office was thick with protocol. In private, he met people like Clara Munro, who painted his portrait in a studio lit by a single lamp, and Samuel Tate, who arranged small gatherings where musicians and ex-soldiers told stories. Yet the institutional machinery of race did not dissolve. At a formal ceremony in August 1918, an officer ridiculed his presence, and Admiral Grant murmured about precedents and protocol until the celebration felt like a lesson in humility. Marcus was suspended from some privileges quietly while being publicly praised by other quarters. He learned that recognition could be performative without shifting the structures that made performance necessary. In this period, he kept a small silver compass, an heirloom his grandfather had carved. He kept a letter from his mother, yellowed with years. These objects sat together in a flight bag like relics in a private chapel. The conversation that stripped him of a place he thought earned came in a corridor behind a banquet room, and it was brutal and measured. Admiral Grant said, "You are useful as an example abroad, but not as a precedent here." Marcus replied, "Are you telling me courage has a passport?" Grant said, "Protocol exists for reason." Pierre Lacroix insisted, "There is no bravery by color in the sky." Rafael Ortega said, "He saved men today." Samuel Tate said, "This is wrong." An aide named Lewis murmured, "This will make trouble." Marcus looked at each man in turn and said, "I did not ask to be a precedent. I only asked to fly." The admiral smiled and said, "There are lines." Marcus answered, "Then I will keep flying until no one remembers where the lines were drawn." That exchange ended with a suspension of certain honors and a transfer to a less visible role, ferrying supplies and doing courier runs where the risk was high but the glory modest. The tension of being publicly lauded and privately sidelined would return many times and would test his resolve. Between wars, Marcus reinvented himself as a figure in the cultural life of Paris in the 1920s and 1930s. He opened a small café near Montparnasse where painters and musicians passed notes, and where Clara Munro and a young poet named Daniel Rousseau read verses by candlelight. The café smelled of espresso and tobacco, of sugar and newspaper ink, and on certain nights, Rosa Alvarez, a Spanish singer, would draw crowds with a voice like velvet. Marcus served coffee with hands accustomed to tightening nuts and bolts. He told stories about the sky and the way a fuselage could sing when hit by sunlight at a particular angle. He collected friends like medals, among them Marie Dubois, who came to sit quietly and exchange news about wounded men, and Josephine, a dancer who wore feathers and politely argued politics at the counter. The cafe became a small refuge for expatriates and veterans, and for a time, Marcus found that life could be modest and rich at once. He preserved his brass medal and the letter from his mother in a drawer beneath the counter, and sometimes a customer found it and listened to the unadorned truth of a man who had flown and been nearly forgotten. When the new war came, Marcus did not stand aside. In 1940, he joined clandestine networks that ferried refugees and messages under the occupation. He worked with Rosa Alvarez and Samuel Tate and a small ring that included Rafael Ortega as mechanic and Marie Dubois as a medical contact. They hid papers in coffee sacks and smuggled people across a night border in the back of a truck that smelled of diesel and wool. The risk was constant, the taste of fear like copper on the tongue. One night they were betrayed, and Marcus was captured by two officers who looked at his pilot's medal as if it were a trivial object and then a crime. In a concrete cell that tasted of damp and bleach, an interrogator asked him why he risked helping others. Marcus answered, "I could not do it." The interrogation that followed is another high-tension scene that altered his life. The interrogator called himself Lieutenant Bernard, and he said, "You are a curiosity, an anomaly." Marcus replied, "I am a man." Bernard sneered, "If the Empire knows you, they will use you." Rosa Alvarez pleaded from outside through a window, "I will not leave you." Samuel Tate banged a fist and said, "You have to hold on, Marcus." Rafael Ortega attempted to bribe a guard and was beaten. Marie Dubois wrote letters and begged officials. There were 7 exchanges in that holding room where Marcus refused to betray anyone and where pain and memory pushed him to the edge. He resisted, and after a long, slow negotiation and the intervention of an unexpected ally, a senior official who had once been saved by Marcus's squadron, a route of escape was arranged. He left in the night with nothing but the brass medal and the compass, and a promise to find a way back to join a larger fight. Marcus returned to his native country years later and found an anonymity that was almost obscene. He worked as a mechanic in a small shop and walked the streets where boys did not look at him and elders nodded with an old courtesy that felt like a shield. He spoke at small gatherings about the sky, and sometimes children would come with wide eyes. In 1959, an American journalist named Helen Park found his old service records in a dusty archive and began to pull threads. Recognition came piecemeal at first, a short column in a paper, then a small ceremony at a veterans center where Captain Harold Jensen, who had become an advocate, read a citation and pinned a ribbon on Marcus's coat. A French ambassador arranged for a plaque to be installed in the square near the airfield where he had learned to taxi. Marcus kept the compass close and the brass medal in a drawer. There was a slow public rediscovery that led to an invitation to a formal ceremony where a school would be named in his honor and where children placed paper planes on the grass 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the event to mark its anniversaries. He died quietly in March 1964 in a small room lined with framed photographs. His funeral was modest, yet over time the rituals of memory multiplied. A plaque was set on a museum wall, a school adopted his name, and a yearly ceremony in the town where he had trained placed flowers on the fuselage fragment that had been saved. "Above us all, we are equal" became a line that appeared on memorials and on a plaque in an air museum. In the months after his death, a foundation created by Clara Monroe and Marie Dubois offered scholarships for young people of color to study aviation and mechanics. The legacy was complicated because institutions that had once ignored him now used his image, while some of the structural barriers he had fought against remained intact. The final image returns to that silver point in the sky that opened this story, the small craft that seemed to say, there is a place above where color does not hold meaning, and where courage meets craft. Marcus Elijah Carter's life asks a question about memory and justice. He rose from trenched earth to the thin, bright margin of the skies, and his medals and letters and a worn leather flight bag live in museums and in the hands of students who study his flight logs. There were many people who braided this life into history. Clara Monroe, who painted his portrait and campaigned for recognition. Rafael Ortega, who taught him engines. Marie Dubois, who dressed his wounds and later organized care for veterans. Captain Harold Jensen, who pushed for his training. Samuel Tate, his brother, who kept faith. And Rosa Alvarez, who risked everything to hide others. There are also structures that failed him. Admiral Wallace Grant, who refused full recognition, and officials who treated his courage as an exception rather than an instrument of change. The epilogue of his life unfolds in 3 times. 1 month after the official ceremony, citizens placed a wreath at the airfield, and children launched model planes into a pale sky with a small banner tied to one that read, "Above us all, we are equal." 3 months later, classrooms held conversations about who belongs in history, and petitions began circulating to add his name to national registers. 6 months on, a small museum opened an exhibit that included his compass, his brass medal, and a letter from his mother that had been translated into 3 languages. These objects became anchors for communal memory and for debates about whom we honor and why. The moral is stubborn and precise. Courage can cross borders, and prejudice can be slow, but memory can be faster if people insist on it. Marcus's story is a testament to individual daring and to collective responsibility. When the wind moves across the old airfield, people still tilt their heads and imagine a small silver bird cutting the blue. Above us all, we are equal, returned into the world not as naive claim, but as a challenge. If this story moved you, consider sharing it so more voices can press the archives. If you want to learn more about Marcus's letters and the documents that corroborate his missions, subscribe and check the sources in the description. The last sight is of a young child in a school uniform releasing a folded plane into the sky. And that paper plane catching a sudden gust and drifting high enough to become a point of silver among clouds above, as if to remind us again that the sky takes everyone, and that some legacies travel by the smallest of wings. Above us all, we are equal.